In the year 536, the world dimmed. The sun weakened, temperatures collapsed, and entire civilizations entered a twilight they could not explain. This is the forgotten catastrophe that changed the course of human history. Welcome to Vexopia. The year 536 did not begin with a warning. It opened like any other year of late antiquity. The Eastern Roman Empire was expanding under Justinian. Trade routes pulsed across the Mediterranean, and the skies above Europe and the Near East carried the same eternal rhythm they had for centuries. But within weeks, something shifted quietly, without thunder, without omen. The world simply dimmed. Ancient writers described the change with a tone of disbelief. Procopius, historian of Justinian's wars, wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon. Others claimed the daylight became thin like twilight, even at noon. Crops failed in regions untouched by war. Temperatures plunged. And as the months dragged on, an eerie stillness settled across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Modern climatologists would one day call this moment the beginning of the late antique Little Ice Age, a climatic shift so catastrophic that it set off famine, plague, and geopolitical collapse across an entire hemisphere. But the people of the 6th century had no such vocabulary. They only felt the cold, the hunger, and the creeping fear that the world itself was unraveling. The dimming was not uniform. Some regions reported a faint reddish glow in the sky, as though sunlight were passing through a veil of dust. Others described mornings that never fully brightened, and evenings that came too early. Tree-ring data from Scandinavia and the Alps later revealed that 536 was the coldest decade in 2,000 years, a collapse so abrupt that it left biological scars around the world. But the most unsettling detail is this: the darkness lasted 18 months. Not 18 days or 18 weeks, 18 months in which the sun never shone normally again. In the ancient cities of the Near East, merchants first noticed something strange with their shadows. They appeared blurred, faint, as though the sun's edge had softened. Farmers in Anatolia reported wheat that yellowed prematurely. In Egypt, the Nile's seasonal pattern faltered. Ships crossing the Mediterranean relied on the stars for navigation, but even the stars seemed dimmer, muted by a haze no one could explain. Humanity searched desperately for meaning. Some blamed divine anger, others whispered of prophecies. But in the courts of Constantinople, the fear was practical. If sunlight had weakened, the empire's grain supply would soon collapse. No one yet understood that the event had not been caused by a normal atmospheric shift, but by something far more. Violent, an eruption so massive that it launched millions of tons of ash into the stratosphere. A volcanic winter, a planetary shadow. The world was entering a new age, not of empires, but of dust. The first true signs of collapse emerged far from imperial capitals, in the rural margins where survival depended on predictable cycles of sun, rain, and soil. In 536, those cycles began to fracture. Farmers across Anatolia and the Balkans reported fields that sprouted late and died early. Grain heads remained thin. Barley kernels failed to fill. Livestock, deprived of fodder, grew gaunt. The famine did not strike like a wave, it seeped in, month by month, as though the world's life force were bleeding out through the sky. Harvest records show yields dropping by half in some regions. In others, crops failed entirely. Villages that had endured wars, droughts, and invasions now faced something far more relentless: a climate that refused to obey nature as rules. Meanwhile, at the imperial court in Constantinople, Justinian's advisors struggled to reconcile the growing crisis with the empire's ambitions. The emperor was in the midst of his grand reconquest, a campaign to reclaim North Africa, Italy, and the Western Roman legacy. These wars depended on vast supplies of grain, ship timber, and manpower. All three were suddenly vanishing. Procopius, observing the situation firsthand, wrote of a sun that seemed like a shadow of itself. But even he could not grasp the scale of the impending catastrophe. The empire's administrators, sensing growing instability, began to hoard resources. Trade slowed, prices soared, panic spread faster than news. And still, the skies remained dim. In northern Europe, the effects were even harsher. Tree ring chronologies from Ireland and Scandinavia reveal a dramatic constriction of growth rings. Starting precisely in 536, the trees recorded what humans could not: a sudden, brutal plunge in temperature, with summer highs resembling late autumn. Frost struck crops in months that should have been warm. Lakes froze early and thawed late. Wild animals fled south, starving as they went. Further east, in China, imperial records describe a yellow dust that fell from the sky, obscuring the sun. Summer snow was reported in regions where it had never been seen. Severe drought alternated with torrential rains. Entire harvests vanished. The Northern Wei dynasty, fragile even before the crisis, fractured under the combined weight of famine and rebellion. Across the Middle East, Syriac chronicles record bred riots, mass migrations, and communities abandoning their homes. Priests interpreted the darkness as a cosmic omen. Astrologers searched the heavens for patterns, but found none. They could not see the stars clearly enough to chart them. And through all of this, ordinary people were left with a single haunting question. Had the sun itself changed? By the winter of 536 to 537, the answer felt unavoidable. Fruit trees failed to blossom. Olive groves withered. The sea, normally a deep blue in the Levant, appeared dull and gray under a sky that refused to brighten. Some coastal towns reported that birds stopped migrating entirely, as if confused by the distorted seasons. Worse was yet to come. The volcanic dust, suspended high in the stratosphere, began to circle the globe, reflecting sunlight away from Earth. Temperatures continued to fall. Crop failures cascaded into food shortages, shortages into famine, and famine into social collapse. But the most devastating consequence of the climate shock was not famine. It was something far older, something waiting in the shadows of the empire's borders. A pathogen. Weak populations are fertile ground for disease, and in this weakened world, the perfect storm was forming. In just a few years, the volcanic winter would help unleash the deadliest plague late antiquity had ever seen, the plague of Justinian. But in 536, no one yet understood that the dimming of the sun was only the beginning. Humanity had stepped into a crisis unlike any it had faced before. A multi-year nightfall, a cooling earth, and a civilization unprepared for the silence that followed. The world had become a colder, hungrier, and far more dangerous place. As the dim sky persisted into the second year, a deeper transformation began, one that would ripple through every layer of society. The crisis was no longer merely agricultural or economic. It was psychological. Civilizations that had taken the sun for granted suddenly faced the possibility that the natural order itself had shifted. In marketplaces from Alexandria to Antioch, whispers spread that the heavens were closing. Priests spoke of judgment. Astrologers warned of endings. Ordinary people, pressed between hunger and fear, sought meaning where none existed. The empire's political machinery strained under the pressure. Justinian's ambition to restore the Roman world required stability, but stability was dissolving at its foundations. Grain shipments from Egypt arrived late or half-empty. North African supplies were erratic. The great granaries of Constantinople, once overflowing, began to ration. Bread prices reached dangerous heights. Soldiers in distant campaigns felt the shortage first, and discipline faltered. Morale, already tested by harsh conditions, eroded rapidly. Meanwhile, caravans crossing the interior of Anatolia reported banditry increasing at an unprecedented rate. Small communities, abandoned by overstretched local authorities, took to desperate measures, raiding neighbors, seizing livestock, or fleeing into the mountains. The empire could not pursue every crisis. It could barely understand the scale of what it faced. But as the human world fought to survive, the natural world left its own unmistakable record. Ice cores from Greenland, drilled centuries later, revealed a thick layer of volcanic ash corresponding precisely to the year 536. This ash, rich in glassy particles, could only come from a colossal eruption, one large enough to inject dust into the stratosphere and block sunlight across the northern hemisphere. Additional layers in 540 and 547 showed that the climate disaster was not a single blow, but a series of strikes. The world was not cooling temporarily. It was entering a climate regime that would last a century. Across the collapsing Eurasian networks, this pattern was already visible. Central Asian steppe societies were forced south by cold, sparking violent migrations. In Persia, the Sasanian Empire, long a formidable rival to Rome, was deeply destabilized by crop failures and internal revolts. In the Arabian Peninsula, shifting climate conditions altered trade and settlement patterns in ways that would later have profound historical consequences. But nowhere was the unraveling more critical than in the Eastern Roman Empire itself, where famine weakened the population in silent preparation for a catastrophe far deadlier than the dimming skies. The first signs appeared in the ports. A few cases of sudden fever, swelling, and rapid death among sailors arriving from Egypt. Then more. Physicians noted symptoms unlike any illness they had recorded. Victims collapsed within days. Lymph nodes swelled to grotesque sizes. Fever burned so hot that many were delirious before death. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. What people did not know, what they could not know, was that the volcanic winter created the perfect breeding ground for the world's most feared killer, Yersinia pestis, the plague bacteria. The cold summers had driven rodents into human settlements. Food shortages had spread them even further, and weakened immunity gave the disease easy passage. Within a few years, the plague would reach Constantinople and kill tens of thousands in a matter of months. By the time it ebbed, it would leave as many as 1/3 of the city dead. In the countryside, entire villages would vanish. The empire's tax base, army, and administrative capacity would collapse with them. All of this famine, disease, migration, rebellion could be traced back to the event that plunged the world into partial darkness in 536. The eruption did more than dim the sun. It destabilized the hemisphere. It created the conditions for a century of geopolitical convulsions, from the fall of kingdoms to the rise of new cultural orders. And yet, in the moment, ordinary people had no such clarity. They only knew that the winters were longer, the summers colder, and the sunlight weaker. They knew that food was scarce. They knew that sickness stalked the roads, the fields, and the cities. And they knew that the world they had inherited from their parents no longer existed in the form they understood. It would take centuries for the earth to fully recover from what happened in 536. By then, empires had risen and fallen, populations had been transformed, and the memory of the dim sun had faded into the realm of myth. But in the heart of the crisis, the people living it believed only one thing: the sky itself had turned against them. By the third year of dim skies, a new pattern emerged across the ancient world, one not recorded in a single chronicle, but visible when the fragments of many sources are brought together. People stopped trusting the seasons. Farmers no longer planted with confidence. Administrators no longer planned with certainty. The rhythms that had guided humanity for millennia, seed time, harvest, migration, trade, lost their predictability. This collapse of temporal order was not just agricultural or economic, it was civilizational. In Constantinople, the imperial bureaucracy produced increasingly anxious correspondence. Taxation records indicated entire districts that had ceased to pay, some because the people had fled, others because there were no people left to pay. Empty villages began to dot the Anatolian landscape. Travelers described settlements where doorways gaped open and fields were overtaken by weeds. The empire responded as empires do. It tightened control. Inspectors were dispatched to estimate losses, collect what little grain remained, and report to the capital. Their observations were chilling. In some communities, people had turned to eating roots, tree bark, or whatever livestock could be spared. In others, hunger gave way to lawlessness villagers, barricading themselves against neighbors, hoarding supplies, and abandoning long-standing customs of hospitality. The thin line separating order from chaos was wearing through. Meanwhile, in the far reaches of northern Europe, evidence gathered centuries later from lake sediments revealed a blanket of volcanic dust so fine it altered the chemistry of entire ecosystems. This microscopic veil distorted sunlight in ways ancient observers could not articulate but instinctively recognized. Their world was dimmer, colder, unfamiliar. Further east, in Persia, royal court documents recorded portents and omens, strange halos around the sun, nights that seemed unusually long, and a reddish tint in the sky that persisted for months. These observations correspond almost exactly with atmospheric conditions expected after a massive tropical eruption, one strong enough to inject ash into the stratosphere and disrupt global climate. Though the Persians could not identify the cause, they felt the pressure of the symptoms. Failing harvests, regional revolts, soldiers ill-equipped for prolonged campaigns in an unexpectedly harsh climate. Yet the greatest transformation was unfolding invisibly within society itself. Food scarcity shifted the balance of power. Those who controlled grain controlled survival. Urban elites retained access to reserves, while rural populations bore the brunt of the famine. This inequality manifested in unrest. In some regions, peasants seized storehouses. In others, mobs attacked caravans. The crisis dissolved the glue of empire, trust in the system's ability to provide. But even as political structures strained, a deeper biological consequence was taking shape. Malnutrition weakened immune defenses across continents. The body's natural resilience eroded. Diseases that had once been survivable became lethal. Infants died in greater numbers. Adults succumbed to illnesses previously considered minor. The population was primed unknowingly for the arrival of a far deadlier threat. That threat would arrive through the arteries of empire, shipping lanes and trade routes. Plague traveled silently on grain ships from Egypt, on caravans rumbling north from the Red Sea, on merchant vessels carrying spices, timber, and textiles. Rodents, stressed by climate disruption, had multiplied and moved in closer proximity to human settlements. Fleas carrying Yersinia pestis thrived in the shifting temperatures. And by the time symptoms appeared in port cities like Pelusium and Alexandria, the chain of transmission was already beyond containment. But in 536, the people living through the crisis could not perceive the future. They did not know that the dimming skies were part of a planetary scale upheaval. They did not know that the cold summers were the opening act of a century-long climatic destabilization. They only saw the signs as fragments, darkened days, shortened harvests, abandoned fields, rising fear. And crucially, they believed the darkness might never end. For ancient cosmologies, the sun was not just light, it was life, order, continuity. To see it weakened was to see the foundations of reality tremble. In monasteries, monks speculated about apocalyptic cycles. In villages, storytellers recounted old myths about cosmic battles and eclipsed suns. In the cities, people gathered at dawn not to begin their day, but to confirm whether daylight would return at all. This was not the collapse of a single kingdom or the misfortune of one generation. It was the unraveling of an entire world system, across continents, across languages, across civilizations. And its consequences would shape the trajectory of history for centuries. The volcanic winter had cast its shadow not for a moment, but for an age. By 537, something extraordinary and terrifying became clear to those who kept careful records. The anomaly was not passing. The dim skies that many had hoped were temporary now appeared woven into the fabric of daily life. Chroniclers in Syria measured the length of days and noted almost no improvement from the year before. Byzantine administrators observed the same in Thrace, Anatolia, and the Aegean. Even when the sun was visible, its light seemed filtered through a veil, too weak to warm the skin, too pale to nourish crops. Human beings are adaptable, but only up to a point. As the crisis persisted, patterns of settlement began to shift. In mountainous regions where cold bit hardest, communities descended toward valleys. Coastal populations migrated inland in search of food. Nomadic groups altered their seasonal routes, placing them in direct conflict with settled communities. These movements, subtle at first, created the earliest tremors of demographic upheaval that would reshape the map of Eurasia in the centuries to come. The economy, strained by scarcity, continued to contract. Trade networks that had endured invasions and political fragmentation now faltered under climatic stress. Merchants traveling the Silk Road carried desperate stories. Oases depleted, caravanserais abandoned, towns where market days had ceased because there was nothing left to exchange. Even the great trading cities of the eastern Mediterranean felt the slowdown. Ships that once carried wine, grain, and olive oil now arrived half-loaded or not at all. Amid this instability, one factor proved especially destructive: the collapse of confidence in the imperial center. Empires depend not only on armies and taxes, but on the belief that their institutions can endure crisis. When that belief erodes, order dissolves from the edges inward. Governors in remote provinces, facing local famine and lacking aid from Constantinople, began to exercise increasing autonomy. Some raised their own militias. Others defied imperial decrees on taxation and grain distribution. The empire's vast administrative web, already stretched thin, began to tear in places too distant for immediate repair. While political structures strained and economies faltered, the natural world recorded its own testimony. Marine sediments show shifts in coastal ecosystems consistent with reduced sunlight penetration. Alpine glaciers expanded, devouring pastures once used by shepherds. Even the sounds of nature changed. Bird migrations shifted. Insect populations collapsed in some areas, while rodents proliferated in others. But it was in the realm of human perception that the crisis left its deepest scars. A sense of cosmic wrongness permeated daily life. In cities, people gathered on rooftops at dawn, staring at the horizon for a sun that rose like a dim ember. In fields, farmers knelt in the soil, testing its warmth with their hands, searching for reassurance. In temples and churches, religious leaders struggled to interpret the signs. Some declared repentance necessary. Others encouraged processions, vigils, or sacrifices. But none could promise relief. This spiritual uncertainty bred a hunger for explanations. Philosophers debated natural causes. Astronomers charted the sky obsessively, though the haze obscured many celestial markers. Medical practitioners documented unusual illnesses, noting how weakened bodies succumbed to fevers more readily. Yet even among the learned, confusion prevailed. The most desperate interpretations emerged from communities living at the margins, small villages, isolated monasteries, frontier towns where fear magnified imagination. Tales circulated of distant lands swallowed by darkness, of animals behaving strangely, of continuous twilight that made it impossible to distinguish night from day. These stories, often exaggerated, reflected not ignorance but anxiety. The world seemed to be shedding its old rules. And then, as if to confirm humanity's deepest fears, a new development destabilized the fragile balance. The haze did not fully disperse even in summer. Grain that survived the cold failed during ripening. Fruits remained small, sour, or misshapen. Pastures produced thin grass, insufficient for herds. Entire food chains faltered. And with every failed harvest, famine tightened its grip. Families began to make impossible choices. Some sold possessions to buy grain at inflated prices. Others sent children to live with distant relatives in areas reported to have better conditions. A few abandoned homes entirely, joining streams of migrants searching for regions less afflicted by the cooling. These migrations would unknowingly carry pathogens along new routes. The stage was being set for one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Yet even then, no one truly understood that they were witnessing the opening chapters of a multi-decade climatic collapse, one that would alter demographics, weaken empires, foster new religious movements, and accelerate the transformation of the ancient world into the medieval one. And through it all, the same question lingered each morning as people opened their doors and looked to the horizon. Would the sun ever return to its former strength? As the 530s approached their midpoint, the world entered a phase that historians centuries later would describe as a cascade system failure. It was not a singular collapse, but a sequence of interconnected breakdowns, each amplifying the next. Climate disruption weakened agriculture. Agricultural failure undermined economies. Economic contraction fueled migration. Migration spread disease. Disease eroded armies and administrations. And weakened states became vulnerable to external pressures they once had the strength to resist. But to the people living through it, this was not a grand historical pattern. It was a relentless tightening of daily hardship. In Constantinople, the subtle shifts in population were the first indicators of deeper trouble. The city, normally a magnet for migrants seeking opportunity, now received people fleeing famine-stricken regions. Entire families arrived at the capital's gates, gaunt and exhausted, hoping for food or work. Many were turned away. Resources were already strained. Those who gained entry often found themselves in overcrowded districts where disease spread rapidly in the cool, stagnant air. At the same time, imperial records show troubling notes: reduced enlistment numbers for the army, increasing desertions, shrinking tax returns, and a marked rise in petty crime. Social cohesion, once upheld by the stability of the empire, gradually weakened as hunger eroded the boundaries of acceptable behavior. In the countryside of Anatolia and Thrace, communities adapted in ways the state could neither predict nor control. Local leaders consolidated power, forming protective alliances. Some villages pooled resources and built communal granaries, rationing supplies through the worst months. Others turned inward, distrustful of outsiders and unwilling to share shrinking harvests. These divergent responses created a patchwork of resilience and desperation across the provinces. The crisis was not uniform. Microclimates meant some regions suffered catastrophically, while others endured only moderate losses. But this unevenness generated another destabilizing force: perception of injustice. People in devastated regions believed they had been abandoned by the empire. Regions that fared slightly better resented the influx of migrants and the burden of strained resources. Resentment became a language spoken across social classes. Meanwhile, in the intellectual centers of the empire, scholars struggled to understand what was unfolding. Monastic communities kept detailed observations of weather, harvests, and celestial anomalies. Philosophers debated whether the dimming of the sun was natural or supernatural. Some argued it was the result of distant fires or atmospheric vapors. Others believed it was a cosmic shift marking the end of an age. None had the tools to identify a volcanic cause, but their writings preserved the emotional and existential weight of the era. Outside the empire, other civilizations documented similar anomalies. In Ireland, annals recorded failure of bread. In China, chroniclers described frost in summer and unseasonal storms. In the Arabian Peninsula, shifting climatic conditions influenced migration and trade patterns, reshaping the socio-political landscape that would soon give rise to new religious and cultural movements. These global echoes reveal that the catastrophe was not regional but hemispheric, a shared darkness that linked distant societies through parallel suffering. Yet through all this, one factor remained the most destabilizing: the erosion of time itself. Seasons no longer aligned with memory. Farmers planted in what should have been spring only to watch their seeds fail. Shepherds drove flocks to pastures that no longer produced enough grass. Mariners miscalculated winds because temperature gradients had shifted. The world had lost its rhythm, and humans, who had always lived by nature's cycles, found themselves in temporal freefall. Into this uncertainty came another phenomenon, one that spread quietly but gained force over the decade: stories. Stories of places where the sun still shone brightly. Stories of kingdoms untouched by famine. Stories that somewhere, beyond the dim horizon, life continued as it once had. These tales were often exaggerations or misunderstandings, but they held immense power. They drove people to migrate, to risk journeys across mountains and seas. They fostered hope and desperation in equal measure, and they accelerated the mixing of populations in ways that would reshape entire regions. But perhaps the most profound stories were those that emerged within communities themselves. In villages, elders spoke of past calamities and how their ancestors endured. In cities, religious leaders framed the crisis within broader cosmological narratives. In isolated monasteries, monks interpreted the dimming as a test of purification before renewal. All of these responses were attempts to impose meaning on an event that defied explanation. And as 537 gave way to 538, one truth lingered beneath every story, every theory, every prayer. The darkness had not lifted. The sun remained veiled. The earth remained cold. And humanity remained suspended in a world it no longer understood. The volcanic winter was not merely an environmental crisis. It was a psychological one, a sustained confrontation with the fragility of existence. The question was no longer whether people could survive the dimming. It was what kind of world would emerge after it. By the late 530s, the world was no longer experiencing a single catastrophe, but a compounding sequence, one that modern science would eventually unravel using ice cores, tree rings, volcanic ash signatures, and climate models. Yet in the ancient world, none of these tools existed. People knew only what they could see, and what they saw was a world losing its balance. In 539 and 540, a shift occurred that would later allow historians to identify the true scale of the disaster. A second volcanic eruption, separate from the great eruption of 536, struck somewhere in the tropics. Ice core evidence from Greenland and Antarctica shows a distinct sulfate spike corresponding to 540, indicating another injection of dust and aerosols into the stratosphere. This second blow deepened the cooling trend, ensuring that the climate destabilization would not be a brief interlude but a lasting transformation. For ancient observers, the consequences were immediate. The haze thickened again. Temperatures failed to rebound. Crop failures intensified. Livestock mortality climbed. The global food system, primitive by modern standards, yet fragile, even then contracted further. And then came the moment historians mark as the culmination of the 536 event: chain reaction, the arrival of the Justinianic Plague, beginning in 541. The plague did not arise in isolation. It was enabled, accelerated, and magnified by the climatic collapse. Cold summers had pushed rodent populations into closer contact with humans. Shortened harvests had driven hungry populations into dense urban centers. Trade networks, though weakened, still carried grain, the perfect medium for stowaway rats and fleas. The first verifiable outbreak struck Pelusium in Egypt. From there, it spread northward along the arteries of empire, finally reaching Constantinople in 542. Procopius recorded that at its peak, thousands died each day. Bodies were stacked in towers when burial grounds overflowed. Entire neighborhoods fell silent. The imperial court was paralyzed as officials, guards, servants, and clerics died in waves. By conservative estimates, the plague killed between 25% and 40% of the population in the affected regions. Recent genomic studies confirm the pathogen responsible was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would later cause the Black Death of the 14th century. This was not coincidence. This was causality. The volcanic winter had prepared the ground. Here is the essential sequence, now firmly supported by interdisciplinary research. 1. 536 eruption gives global dimming. 2. 536 to 540 gives temperature drop, crop failures, famine. 3. 540 eruption gives second atmospheric shock. 4. 541 to 549 gives Justinianic Plague, fueled by weakened populations. This combination climate collapse, plus famine, plus pandemic-triggered demographic, military, and economic decline so profound that the Eastern Roman Empire would never fully recover. But the consequences were not limited to the Mediterranean. Across Eurasia, in Scandinavia, archaeological surveys show entire farms abandoned after 536. In Ireland, the annalistic term failure of bread appears repeatedly. In East Asia, chronicles report strange atmospheric phenomena and year after year harvest failures. Nomadic tribes shifted routes, initiating conflicts that reshaped political landscapes from Persia to the Balkans. A true hemispheric crisis was unfolding. Yet even as the world suffered, the people living through it possessed no framework for the magnitude of what was happening. They preserved details, not explanations. The sun darkened. The air grew cold. Summer failed. Disease swept the land. It would take modern science satellite data, volcanic chemistry, dendrochronology, climate modeling to decode their observations and map them onto a coherent timeline. Here, then, embedded within this narrative, is the critical factual core that every Vexopia Islaicisi Bilming Zorandater. The year 536 is widely considered by scientists to be the worst year to be alive in the historical record. It marked the beginning of a multi-decade climatic downturn known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, triggered by a massive volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland or the tropics. It caused sunlight dimming across the northern hemisphere. A second eruption in 540 intensified the effects. These climatic shocks set the perfect stage for the Justinianic Plague, 541 to 549. The result was a global demographic collapse, weakening empires and altering the trajectory of history. This is not myth. This is not dramatization. This is one of the most significant yet least known turning points in human history. And the people who lived through it believed, with reason, that the world was ending. By the time the skies finally began to clear gradually, hesitantly, as though the world were relearning how to breathe, nothing was the same. The volcanic winter had not destroyed humanity, but it had reshaped it, forcing entire civilizations into new trajectories, whose effects would echo for more than a millennium. When we reconstruct the events of 536 to 550 with modern scientific tools, a clearer and more astonishing picture emerges, one that the people of late antiquity could never have imagined, yet one they lived through with extraordinary resilience. The catalyst was almost certainly a massive volcanic eruption, likely from the northern hemisphere, though its exact origin remains debated. Candidates include Iceland, Alja, or an earlier fissure eruption. A major tropical volcano, unidentified, whose signature appears in both polarized sheets ice core data, reveals a sudden spike in volcanic sulfate in 536, followed by another in 540, and yet another in 547. These are physical fingerprints, chemical shadows of the ash and aerosols that darken the sky. Tree ring data from Europe, Asia, and the Americas confirms a dramatic global cooling, with temperatures dropping 2 degrees Celsius to 4 degrees Celsius in some regions. This may not sound extreme by modern standards, but in an agricultural civilization without industrial buffers, it was catastrophic. A few degrees meant failed harvests, empty granaries, dead livestock, and famine. And it meant weakened immune systems across continents fertile ground for a pandemic. When Yersinia pestis emerged in 541, the world was already wounded. The plague spread was not merely biological, it was structural. The climate crisis had created the conditions for its acceleration. The plague, in turn, amplified the climate crisis's effects. This combination, a climate shock followed by a pandemic, was unprecedented in recorded history. Modern researchers now agree on several critical points. The 536 event marks the start of the late antique Little Ice Age, 536 to 660. It contributed directly to the weakening of the Eastern Roman Empire. It destabilized the Sasanian Empire, contributing to its eventual collapse. It set demographic pressures in motion across Eurasia. It influenced religious, cultural, and political transformations in multiple regions. Civilizations do not collapse from a single blow. They falter under the weight of interconnected stresses. In the 6th century, those stresses aligned with extraordinary precision. To understand how transformative these decades were, consider the following parallels. Before 536, the Eastern Roman Empire was expanding. After 536, it struggled simply to survive. Before 536, the Sasanian Empire was stable. After 536, it entered a century of decline. Before 536, population growth sustained dense urban centers. After 536, cities shrank dramatically. Before 536, trade networks linked continents. After 536, many collapsed and would not fully recover for centuries. We often imagine history as shaped by emperors, wars, and great ideas. But in 536, the most consequential force was not human. It was the earth itself. A single eruption cast a veil over the sky. A second eruption deepened the chill. A pandemic finished what the darkness began. And yet, despite all of this, humanity endured. People found ways to adapt, moving, rebuilding, changing, surviving. The 6th century stands as a testament to both the fragility and the endurance of civilization. Today, when scientists call 536 the worst year to be alive, it is not hyperbole. It is the verdict of archaeology, climatology, dendrochronology, epidemiology, and historical analysis combined. But that phrase tells only half the story. The truth is this: 536 was also the beginning of one of the most significant transformations in world history. A transformation not driven by kings or conquerors, but by a silent force drifting high above the earth, a veil of volcanic dust that dimmed the sun, cooled the world, and altered the destiny of empires. The sunlight eventually returned, the world warmed again, but nothing went back to the way it had been. Humanity stepped out of the haze into a different age, scarred, diminished, but changed in ways that would shape the medieval world and, ultimately, the world we inhabit today. This was not merely a climate event. It was a rewriting of history by the hand of nature itself. And it began with a year when the sun forgot how to shine. History is not shaped only by empires and kings. Sometimes the earth itself rewrites our destiny. If this journey moved you, join us for the next chapter of Vexopia.